for a plethora of readers. Know your subject. To achieve clarity, you must know thoroughly and competently what you are writing about. Until your mastery of the subject is complete, you will not be able to decide about form or structure, and neither you be able to write this conviction. Be interested in your subject. Choose only those subjects that move you, for only if the writer writes with passionate conviction will the reader be moved. Be clear. While the reader should be engaged in the unraveling of the mystery of what you are saying, don't make yourself writing so opaque that it is accessible not to an audience of one yourself. Third, master the language you are using. It is only way by manipulating the language skillfully that great and complex thought can be communicated effectively. Sorry. Fifth, choose your words carefully. When readers encounter a word that they could have not have foreseen or which they could not have possibly thought of themselves, they get interested and pay attention. When the word is both unforeseen and effective, they are pleased. Engage the reader from beginning to end. If you let the reader's interest flag at any point, your writing will fall apart, the illusion will break, and your reader will turn to something else. Let the reader feel that she is participating in an exciting adventure. This was also Joseph's Conrad's chief credo as a writer and is one of the primary reasons for his popularity across the world. My task, which I am trying to achieve, is by the power of the written word to make you hear, to make you feel. It is above all to make you see. Enrique Gide adds to Conrad's timeless words when he says, "To read a writer for me is not merely to get an idea of what he says, but to go off with him and travel in his company. All this is easier and said than done, and no amount of advice or guidelines can make you a good writer. The key is to practice and persevere, and also keep the reader in mind. As Linda Flower tells us in the Writing for an Audience, any writer to be successful must establish a common ground between the reader and her himself, one that lessens their differences in knowledge, attitudes, and needs. Although we can never be certain who might read what we write, it is nevertheless important for us to have a target audience in mind. All the decisions we make as writers are influenced by that real or imagined reader. The goal of the writer is to create a momentary common ground between the reader and her himself. You want the writer to share your knowledge and your attitude towards that knowledge. Even if the reader eventually disagrees, you want him or her to be able for the moment to see things as you see them. A good piece of writing closes the gap between you and the reader. The first step in closing that gap is to gauge the distance between the two of you. Sometimes obvious differences such as age, background will be important, but the critical differences for writers usually fall into three areas: the reader's knowledge about the topic, his or her attitudes towards it, and his or her personal or professional needs and interest. Effective readers do not simply express what they know, like a student mentally filling up an examination answer book. Instead, they use their knowledge, reorganizing, maybe even rethinking their ideas to meet the demands of an assignment or the needs of the reader. A successful communicator thus makes full and proper use of all the grammar and lexical possibilities in the language so as to produce an attractive and effective result. If we think about writing as communication, a possible way to do is to think of the process in 6 steps: idea, second, meaning, third, organization, fourth, fine tuning, fifth, have I got it right, sixth, eureka, text. An accurate assessment of your intended audience will also help you to answer many of the formal and stylistic questions that arise in preparing a manuscript. Writers have complete freedom to choose their styles, but must try and aspire to by its being direct and clear, organized and coherent, and forceful and convincing. Careful writers also avoid the use of language that is prejudicial to any class or category of people and avoid statements that reflect or imply unsubstantiated generalizations about age, economic class, national origin, sexual orientation, political or religious belief, race, or gender. Section 1, Writing Poetry. Ars Poetica. A poem which a poem begins where prose ends, at the edge of the word. Every word that we speak is composed of breath. On this most intangible foundation rests the way of poetry. R. Parthasarthi. The title of a work on poetics by the Roman poet. A poem is an exploration rather than a disquisition. Disquisition. By this, Robin Skelton means that a poem is not a way of stating something that you already know in a clear and precise manner. Instead, it is how a poet tries to figure things out, a way of trying to organize one's thoughts and feelings about a subject, to find a pattern in the chaos and come to some sort of resolution or conclusion. More mundanely, a poem is a metrical composition or an elevated composition in verse. When we think of poetry, we think of lines and stanzas, rhythm and rhyme scheme, fancy language and beautiful words. Sometimes we think writing poetry is easy, it just flows out and every word is perfect and you should never edit or you will lose the energy of the work. Other times we think we are just no good at it and we will never be a poet and we should stop trying. Almost any poem can be improved by revising. Some poems will need more revision than others, and nearly everyone can become a good poet, if not a great one. The key to unlocking the mystery of poetry, aside from learning the technical details, is finding the right things for to write about. This won't be the same as the right things for someone else. Definition of poetry. What is a poem? When I tell you in class that we are going to be reading a poetry, you all have a definite idea of what that means. And when you open up your anthology and read, success is counted sweetness. Success is counted sweetest by those who have never succeed. To comprehend the nectar requires sorest need. Pain by Emily Dickinson. You easily recognize it as a poetry, and we could pretty easily settle on a basic definition of poetry. Poetry is imaginative language arranged in lines set to a particular rhythm that works at a basic level, but it has a few problems. Not first of all, not all poems are lined. There are things called prose poems that are unlined poems, but those account for a very small percentage of poems. The bigger problem with this definition is that it does not account for all the many things poetry can do. When a poet or critic defines poetry, he or she usually tries to capture that more elusive sense of what makes a poem special. Here are some definitions of poetry given by famous poets. The Best Words in the Best Order by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. The spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, William Wordsworth. Emotion put into measure, Thomas Hardy. Not the assertion that something is true, but the making of that truth more fully real to us, by T.S. Eliot. Hundreds of things coming together at the right moment. Elizabeth Bishop, excuse me, life distilled Gwendolyn Brooks. One thing you might notice about this definition is that they are pretty vague. None of these definitions would explain in any details how T.S. Eliot could come up with lines such as these. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. One reason why poetry is so hard to define is that poems do many things. In fact, poems can do anything that prose can do, or no one worries about defining prose. You can find poems on politics, religion, philosophy, and love. Poetry can never be advertising copy. Commercial jingles, after all, are a form of poetry. The four functions of language. One way to talk about what is happening in poetry is to look at the different functions of language or basic task of language. The rhetorical function, language used to persuade someone of a particular point of view. Example, a politician's speech. The definitive function, language used to define and describe the world. Example, a scientific report describing a new species of bird. The informative function, language used to convey information, example an encyclopedia. The poetical function, language used for pleasure, example poetry. Most pieces of writing will contain a picture of these four functions but will emphasize one. For example, a politician giving a speech will mostly try to persuade you of his or her position, but as a part of that argument, the speaker may also have to inform people, define terms, and use language that sounds good. In his inaugural address, President John F. Kennedy said to the nation, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." He was telling people they should work for their country and not just expect to get stuff from it. That's not a popular message, but in part it was successful because Kennedy expressed it in memorable language. Poetry generally emphasizes the poetic function. Poems can though also pursue and define. When we analyze or interpret poems, we are usually at their rhetorical or definitive aspects. Informative poems are rare, but also don't lose sight of the fact that poems exist primarily to fulfill the poetic function, to please us. What to write about and how to start. As with any kind of writing, poets generally write about that they feel strongly about. The first task in becoming a poet is to find out what affects you the most. What are the things that make you angry, that make you shiver or cry, or grind your teeth so that hard it hurts? Even if those topics seem trivial, if they cause a strong reaction in you, then you will be able to write honestly and strongly about them and make them seem significant to your users. Once you discover the things that affect you, you may need to push on one step farther. So think carefully about the things that disturb you, or fascinate you, or frighten you, if you can figure out why you have that reaction, you may find that you then have the subject matter for a poem, or more likely, many poems. By deciding to write poetry, you may have made a commitment to express your contemporary life and environment through the medium of language. Your content will be achieved through the words you employ, the language, uh, the constructs of language you use, and your application to the techniques of craft based on a knowledge of the elements of prosody. Your goal should be to make the medium and content become one. To become a poet takes a combination of talent, sensitivity, humility, and pride, knowledge and insight, and a fascination with the process of language as a living phenomenon. In writing your poems, you will call into play all levels of yourself, those readily available and some of which you will have to reach deep into yourself. You will rely on your thinking and your feeling. One without the other is addressing only half the process of creating a poem. The first thing to realize is that the real poet handles personal material in such a way that it achieves universal quality that will include the reader in the experience. By all means, avail yourself to the treasures of your experience storehouse, but keep in mind your responsibility for refining, distilling, and transforming that raw material into art, and the fact that your reader needs to empathize and participate in your poem. Emotions and feelings are often used as synonyms, but have an important distinction you need to keep in mind. Emotions, any of the states designated as fear, anger, joy, surprise, disgust, hate, love, grief, etc. Feelings, appreciative recognition, a partly physical and partly mental response. A poem involves two people, the poet and the reader, and emotion is what connects them to each other. A good poem moves the reader, is a critical and artistic truism, and it is emotion that gives atmosphere to the poem, and feeling is what you, the poet, reaching out to your readers on a physical and emotional level, impart. The reader may be moved for purely aesthetic reasons, that is, delighted by your skill or craft, or because the poem has touched a chord in her or him and evoked a response. While you are transmitting the poem's feeling in this way to the auditor's intellect for interpretation, the poem's structural and technical features are directing the meaning, rich and emphasizing as your own store of resources may be. You have the whole world around you from which you can cull ideas if you let your imagination loose upon the environment. Appreciative subjectively but appraise objectively. That is to say, the poet, while in the grip of an emotion, is also in control of it, while possessed by the emotion, should also possess, have mastery over it. All around you exist countless reasons for poems. People with whom you come in contact, read, hear about, events you witness, relationship you experience or observe, the phenomena of the natural environment, the list is endless. Poetry and prose. A recurrent question is the distinction between poetry and prose, a working definition with which to begin answering this vexing VEXING question could be: a poem is an integrated literary composition, tightly expressed, that is not restricted to discursive progression and logic but operates on a traditional level. We saw about that words are used for ordinary speech, for discursive or logical thought, and for literature. Discursive language that makes statements of fact is judged by standards of truth and falsehood and is in prose. Literature makes no statements of fact, proceeds hypothetically, and is judged by imaginative consistency. The best way then to distinguish literary from non-literary writing is by looking at intention, what the writer hopes to do with what he or she has written. If the writing is intended to describe and represent facts and be judged by its truth, it normally belongs to some non-literary category. If it is to be judged by its imaginative consistency, it normally belongs to literature. Some prose pieces are utilitarian, like a news story in the newspaper, a textbook, a biography, and a book of spiritual guidance. Are those works of art, or are they artful uses of language? Are they primarily instruments for recording and conveying information, or for moving people to action? They exist for the result they can produce. Other prose composition exist for themselves, like novels, short stories, and plays. When we talk about prose, we do not mean the language of ordinary speech alone. Prose is ordinary speech on its best behavior. It is conventionalization of speech that is made by the educated or articulate person when he or she is trying to assimilate speech patterns to thought patterns. There are mainly two ways in which this can be done: by using a simple regularly recurring meter, or by developing a sentence. When the former is used, we have verse, and the latter makes prose. Prose then is an artful use of language insofar as it is consciously for effect has a stylistic tradition and needs to be learned. The main difference then between verse and prose is rhythm. Also, verse is able to absorb a much higher concentration of metaphorical and figurative speech than prose. Poetry has form, shape, pattern, agreement, as well as theme and subject. A common mistake that made while defining poetry is to see it as having a distinct subject matter, a form, and a mode of apprehension. This is not enough to help us, as poets have used and continue to write on a huge variety of subjects and use a multitude of forms. New ones are inverted every so often by a mode of apprehension. We mean that the poet has looked at the external world in a particular way and transmuted this raw material into poetry. The problem is with this is that it makes poetry a way of thinking rather than a way of writing, and poetry is after all a way of writing, a distinctive use of language. Look at the example below. The first two are written by the Indian English poet Agha Shahid Ali and on the same theme about news he received from his friends and family in Kashmir about the conditions there. Now, notice how the first is arranged and how it reads like a poem. In the case of the second, the latter way, while the arrangement is more like prose, the rhythm of the lines indicates to us that it is poetry, a prose poem. Therefore, what you need to think about is it only the arrangement of words on the page, or does a poem have a spoken rhythm that makes it a different genre from the prose passage? Postcard from Kashmir. Kashmir shrinks into my mailbox. My home a neat 4 by 6 inches. I always loved neatness. Now I hold the half-inch Himalayas in my hand. This is home, and this is the closest I will ever be to home. When I return, the colors won't be so brilliant, so ultramarine, my love so overexposed, and my memory will be a little out of focus. In it, a giant negative, black and white, still undeveloped. Dear Shahid, I am writing to you from your far off country, far even from us who live here, where you no longer are. Everyone carries his address in his pocket so that at least his body will reach home. Rumors break on their way to us from the city, but the word still reaches us from border towns. Men are forced to stand barefoot in snow waters all night. The women are alone inside. Soldiers smash radios and televisions. With bare hands, they tear our houses to pieces. Another way we can try and get a grip on what poetry is to see what it is not. Read the lines below and see how, although they look like poetry, something is missing. Poetry is a manifestation of the inner vistas of the human mind, wherein it puts psychological crises on record and unwinds these through myth, allegory, metaphor, image, and symbol. How does one, in the final analysis, get to know this chameleon poetry at all? One way is to become familiar with the history, traditions, and development of this art. In art, nothing dies, it merely moves through change. Conventions, traditions, this offers temporary reference points, temporary because conventions and traditions also change with development and experimentation. Stylistic devices, persistent character types, forms, themes, pattern, manner, and style of presentation of various subjects reoccurring in poetry develop into conventions. Adherence to a particular set of convention over a period of time leads to the establishment of a tradition. In turn, traditions are influenced by further developments and experiments. Through such cycles, the art of poetry continues to lead a healthy life. Shape, form, and technique. There should be shape to all poems, whether determined by a traditional form or by an organic form that results from a free play of ideas or the design that evolves from working with open techniques. In addition to shape, the poem also has nature, an inner quality that it is its essence. This combination of shape and nature gives the poem its appearance, that by which a thing is truly known. Since a poem is a composition in which all the parts contribute to its total aesthetic effect, and since the removal of any one part would destroy the poem, we are responsible for ensuring that the shape and nature of the poem combine in a synergistic whole. Form in poetry may be defined as the manner in which a poem is composed, as distinct from what the poem is about. Form could be the meter or words that is used in the poem, the words that the poet chooses to express ideas, emotion, etc., the language and diction of the poem, in other words, the style of composition. Poetry as an auditory art. Given all these theories, poetry is ultimately an art of sounds. The page on which the poem appears is the musical score of the reader, direction as to how the poem is to be sounded, whether the form is fixed or free. The poem structure guides the reader through its meaning, and it is this we will on now look at. Experience and enjoyment of poetry starts with hearing it, and when you look around you, you will see that your environment is full of words, radio, TV, video, and computer games, advertisements, greeting cards, films, etc. Poetry appeals to all our senses, the eye, tongue, ear, limbs, heart, bones, and blood, but also to be the mind. In its writing and performance, it depends on the arrangement of sounds in space. It has its own choreography on the page and its rhythms, emphasis, and cadences on the airwaves. The heard and felt experience of poetry is the first step in the risky business of writing it. Prosody is the most general term in correct use in the current use to refer to the elements and structures involved in the rhythmic or dynamic aspects of speech, and it is some of elements of prosody that we will now look at now. Rhythm, rhyme, and meter. It is possible to write poetry without rhyme and meter, but impossible to do without rhythm. Whether you prefer the metrical designs of traditional forms or the freer rhythms of natural speech, making use of the rhythms of language is vital for crafting poetry. Concerning the matching of sound and sense in the rhythm of poetry, Alexander Pope gives this advice to budding poems in his essay on criticism. True ease in writing comes from art, not chance, as those move easiest who have learned to dance. This not enough, no harshness gives offense. The sound must seem an echo to the sense. Soft is the strain when Japafia gently blows, and the smooth stream in smoother number flows. But now when loud surges lash the sounding shore, the hoarse, rough verse should, like the torrent, roar. Rhythm in poetry includes stress or accent, quantity, the duration or length of a syllable, and pitch. Metrical stress is the emphasis or weight imposed in the line, dictated by the designs of the meter. Thus, the kind of apostrophe sign identifies the beats for long ones or stressed syllables, and and kind of small v for shorter one, or unstressed syllables. In other words, beat is measured in time rather than by pitch and volume alone. Scansion is the analysis of the metrical rhythm of a line. When we scan a poetry of English, we count by syllable and stress to determine how many syllables there are and what kind of stress. This helps us to measure the line in feet. A foot is a measurable pattern unit of poetic rhythm. While rhythm and meter are related to each other, the difference is that rhythm is the natural beat as it exists in the words themselves, and meter is the number of beats organized into a pattern. Another word for used for feet is beat. And this poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge is a great mnemonic to help you remember the most commonly used feet that poems use to sing their songs. Each line of the poem not only defines each type of foot mentioned in it, but when scanned is also an example of the particular use of the particular foot in composition. Metrical foot feet, a lesson for a boy. Trochee trips from long to short, from long to long is in solemn sort. Slow spondy stalks, strong foot, yea, illable. Ever to come up with dactyls, price label, lambics, march from short to long, with a leap and a bound the swift anarpest throng. In syllabic words, the measuring element is not quantity, stress, or word accent, but the number of syllables in a line. Pattern plays an important part in this kind of poetry, and the more complex the pattern unit, the more complex the rhythm. An interesting syllabic form of poetry is the cinquain, a symbolic, a, a syllabic 5-line poem in which the number of syllables per line is fixed. Two syllables make up the first and fifth line, while the second, third, fourth have 4, 6, and 8 syllables respectively. This form was invented by Adelaide Crapsey, and her poem is an enduring example of the form's use. Triad. This be three silent things: the falling snow, the hour before the dawn, the mouth of one just dead. The syllable plays an important role in connection with the rhythms of poetry, as do the letters of the alphabet themselves as they create the syllables. Language is a living entity and have a variable and developing nature. Since poetry is an art intended to be heard, language as it is spoken plays a major part in the composition of poetry. Our professional interest in consonant and vowels, letters and their sounds comes from the texture they make possible in lines of poetry. Smoothness, harshness, conflict, sibilance, harmony and dissonance. A syllable is something held together and can be defined as a group of letters taken together to form one sound, an uninterrupted unit of utterance, a complete word or part of a word. You will notice as you speak that your voice mechanism adjusts itself to enunciate syllables rather than words, and invoicing syllables. You are therefore pronouncing combination of letters. Keep this in mind while planning the sounds that will best support the sense of your poems. As you take care to make sure that the syllable formed into words echo the sense, see that the syllables are combined and sequenced in a way that is harmonious and do not jar and thump. The mood, theme, and atmosphere of the lines will determine the sound that should be heard, even by the inner ear, when the lines are read. Just to give you an example of how sound translates into sense in a poem. Depending on how you arrange the words, look at the two stanzas below. The first is melodious, keeping in mind with its theme, and the second harsher and more jumpy in its sound and sense. The passionate shepherd to his love. Come live with me and be my love, and we will all the pleasures prove that hills and valleys, dell and field, and all the craggy mountains yield. Christopher Marvellov. In my craft in my craft or sullen art exercised in the still night, when only the moon rages and the lovers lie abed with all their griefs in their arm, I labor by singing light. Dylan Thomas. Diction is the selection and arrangement of words in a literary work. Poetic diction means that the specifically poetic words and phrases which express the imaginative and impassioned nature of poetry. The diction you choose will be determined by the nature of the subject, the quality of the mood, the atmosphere, and the current use of the language. Diction is therefore the vocabulary of the poem, and the way this vocabulary is arranged into stanzas and word cluster which will eventually constitute your style. The first step for the poet is to be sensitive to the effect produced by words that are concrete or abstract, literal or figurative, common or technical, formal or colloquial, etc. The degree to which they establish denotation and connotation in combination with other words. The tone of your poem will depend on your relationship to the material and your attitudes toward your real or imagined audience. The tone of a speaker's voice may reveal information about his feelings, wishes, attitudes, beliefs, etc. Thus, attitudes determine tone, and tone reflects attitudes. Since poetry is regarded as a specialization of language for the communication of attitudes, the determination of the exact shading of tone in a particular poem is very important. Image and symbols. While writing poetry, your words, tone, and diction are animated by images and symbols. The image in poetry describes something in terms of concrete detail. To form a word picture, imagery is the term used to denote the totality of images appearing in the whole poem or a section of it. The most impressive quality of images is that they evoke mental pictures in the reader's mind so that the experience of reading the poem becomes a visual one along with the auditory. Imagery can also be mental. The focus is on what happens in the reader's mind. Figures of speech that use language in ways that are different from everyday speech and symbolic, representative of something imaginary, can be interpreted in terms of whether it functions to vivify the subject, reveal the speaker's mood, externalize the speaker's thoughts, direct the reader's attitude, and guide his expectations. Invention defines the quality of originality you can bring to bear on your choice of form and structure. Form and structure. Invention defines the quality of originality you can bring to bear on your choice of form and structure, diction and tone, and poetic linguistic devices you make use of. When we come to symbol, we have come a full circle because a symbol, like a word, represents something else. The word symbol derives from Greek verb symbalion, to put together. It therefore denotes a joining or combining whereby a material object is used to represent an immaterial idea, thought, experience. For example, the image of climbing a staircase hill and the difficulty and effort involved is used to represent the idea of raising oneself economically, spiritually, or socially. While some symbols are universally understood, others are specific to the creative work itself and need to be decoded by the reader. Words normally represent agreed upon ideas or objects, but symbols are radiational, like the sun, and increase their significance through reappearance and communal acceptance. Traffic signs, flags, logos, doves, etc. are all universally understood symbols. However, in poetry, the symbol has a special significance as it allows the poem the freedom to exploit connotative and denotative meanings in a wider sense for the purposes of intensification, tightness, heightening expression, and so on. Quite often, symbols help poets to express that which cannot be articulated directly and needs a more abstract means to bring out the meaning fully. The form of a poem is easier to understand and detect than its content, that is, ideas and their development, metaphor, mood, tonality, emotion, intensification, climax, and resolution. The physical components rely on design and plan and are revealed upon the analysis of the organization as a schematic level. The content elements are understood through interpretation of details, the development of imagery, diction, syntax, color, atmosphere, etc. In traditional forms, the poem has a diagram with which to work. In free verse, the shape is generated by the material as it goes through the process of being designed into a poem. Rhyme and reason. The most familiar sound device in poetry is rhyme. Rhyme is commonly understood as the recurrence of duplicate or similar sound at predictable intervals at the ends of line. The rhyming unit is the syllable. The meaning of the word metrical is a metrical rhetorical device based on the sound identities of words. The arrangement of final words in succeeding lines is called rhyme scheme. Besides calling attention to the words and syllables as musical sounds, rhyme mark the ends of rhythmic units represented by the lines. Rhymes also serve to meld the poem's lines into the pattern of the stanza and emphasize the melodic quality of the poem's diction. Now we will learn a little more about the kinds of rhyme that have been used by poems and will be a fund of ideas for you. Structural elements. There are the physical parts of the structure of a poem and include meter and rhythm, lines, stanzas, rhyme, and sound patterns. Here are some popular forms that are self-contained units in a poem or sometimes the poem itself. Couplet, a unit in poetry made up of two lines that usually rhyme and are composed in the same meter. If there is a natural pause at the end of the second line and the unit is complete, it is a closed couplet. Sorry. The rap of the lock. The rape of the lock. Unnumbered treasures up at once, and here the various offerings of the world appear. Semicolon. From each she nicely culls with curious toil, comma, and decks the goddess with the glittering spoil. Full stop. This cascade idea India's glowing gems unlocks, comma, and all Arabia breathes from yonder box. Full stop. Alexander Pope. And an open couplet is one in which the second line is a run-on line and the sense and thought are completed in the succeeding couplet. Endymion, a thing of beauty is a joy forever. Its loveliness increases, will never pass into nothingness, but still will keep a bower quiet for us and asleep, full sweet of dreams and hearth and being quiet breathing by John Keats. Tercet slash terza rima, a stanza that is a group of lines related to an idea matrix and forming a pattern made up of three lines either rhymed or unrhymed is a tercet or a triplet. Order to the west wind, O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing, yellow and black and pale and hectic red, pestilence-stricken multitudes, O thou, who chariotest to their dark wintry bed, by Percy Bysshe Shelley. Quatrain. This is the most popular organizing unit in English poetry, and each stanza has 4 lines and rhymes vary from none at all to two. In memoriam. I hold it true whatever befall. I feel it when I sorrow most. 'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. By Alfred Lord Tennyson. Depending on the number of lines used in a stanza, other forms are quintian, a 5 line stanza, sestet, a 6 line stanza, the septet that uses 7 lines, and octave that uses 8. The most common forms, however, remain couplets, tercets, and quatrains. Fixed forms and free verse. From a basic introduction to stanza forms, let us now look at some common forms in which poems are crafted. Poetic form is divided into two main categories: fixed forms such as sonnet and villanelle, and organic forms, which evolves from within poem itself. Within the former, we also have abundant examples of non-metric fixed forms that generally rely on a sculpted or picture shape. The typographical arrangement is designed to reinforce the theme or sense. In it reigns Apollinaire has arranged the lines in wavering verticals, and poems with the lines arranged in the shape of crosses, umbrellas, and piers abound. See if you can find more such shape or sculpted poems, and then find out whether the shaping in any way related to the dominant mood or the content of the poem, or is just a visual device. George Herbert's Easter Wings, given below, is wing-shaped. The shape of the poem is in keeping with the theme, the desire of the devout and repentant believer to merge his souls with God's, with his belief giving him the wings to ascend to this blessed state. Easter wings, Lord, who created man in wealth and store. Next line. Though foolishly he lost the same. Next line. Decaying more and more. Next line. Till he became, next line, poor, most poor. Next stanza. With this, with thee, next line. Oh, let me rise. Next line. As larks harmoniously. Next line. And sing this day the victories. Next line. Then shall the fall further the flight in me. Next stanza. My tender age in sorrow did begin. Next line. And still with sickness and shame. Next line. Thou didst so punish sin. Next line. That I become. Next line. Most thin. Next stanza. With thee. Next line. Let me combine. Next line. And feel this day the victory. Next line. For if I imp my wing on thin. Next line. Affliction shall advance the flight in me. George Herbert. Sonnets. The sonnet is a poem of 14 lines that expresses a single idea, thought, or sentiment. The poem is normally divided into two parts: the octave, 8 lines, and the sestet, 6 lines, or into 4 sections of 3 quatrains and a couplet. A rhyme scheme varies but is regular, and the lines also carefully measured according to meter to give it a melodious rhythm. Another sorry. Another characteristic of the sonnet is the volta, turn, that is a shift in the direction of the poet's thought or emotion. The sonnet is normally concludes by affirming the idea explored in the course of its expression, or by completely turning the thought around to give the reader a surprise or a new insight. The sonnet is a simple form but makes great demands on the poet who needs to compress his or her ideas into the given form. This makes for a complex and intense expression of thought and feeling. Sonnet 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer day, thou art more lovely and more temperate? Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometimes too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion deemed, and by every fair from fair sometimes decline by chance or nature's changing course undreamed. But the eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair though offset, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as man can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. William Shakespeare. Villanelle. Villanelle. This is a poem in 6 stanzas, the first five of which are tercets, and the final a a quatrain. The entire poem is constructed on two rhyme sounds, and the stanza are linked through repeat lines and the rhymes. The first line of the first stanza is repeated as the last of the second and fourth stanzas, and the last of first stanza appears as the final line of the third and fifth stanzas, and both these lines, that is the first and last lines of the first stanza, form the concluding couplet of the sixth stanza. The form is used to express a variety of ideas and emotions, from the most serious and philosophical to the most light-hearted. The challenge lies not only in the form but also in intensifying the expression with every repetition, so that the form and substance complement each other and the poem moves forward not in fits and starts, but with a renewed power and evocation. The final stanza should draw the attention into the poem to share the poet's concerns and feelings, while the best known example of the villanelle is "Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night" by Dylan Thomas. Another well-known practitioner of the form is Edwin Arlington Robinson, and here is his villanelle. The house on the hill. They are all gone away. The house is shut and still. There is nothing more to say. Through broken wall and grey, the winds blow bleak and shrill. They are all gone away, nor is there one today to speak them good or ill. There is nothing more to say. Why is it then we stray around the sunken sill? They are all gone away, and our poor fancy play for them is wasted skill. There is nothing more to say. There is ruin and decay in the house on the hill. They are all gone away. There is nothing more to say. Haiku. This Japanese form is a short self-contained 17-syllable form that is composed of 3 lines with 5, 7 and 5 syllables respectively. The aim of the haiku is to express a delicate and nuanced insight through a concrete image. The poem evolves from a single image, and the imagery is primarily drawn from nature, with the time of the year, season implied or stated. The last line of the haiku is vital, since it is the insight line and reveals the intent or meaning of the whole poem. Now the swinging bridge is quietened with creepers, like our tendrilled lives. Basho. Light-hearted forms. Humor. Excuse me. Light-hearted forms. Humor is also a vital ingredient of poetry, and clary hues, limericks, and epigrams have been written to great poetic impact. A clary hue consists of two couplets of unequal length, often with complex, sometimes ridiculous rhymes, and presents a potted biography of a famous person or historical character. The humor consists in concentrating on the trivial, fantastic, or ridiculous, and presenting it with great solemnity as if it were characteristic, as significant, or essential. Example from the poem of Edmund Clerihew Bentley, who gave this form its name, are given below. The art of biography is different from geography. Geography is about maps, but biography is about chaps. Sir Humphrey Davy detested gravy. He lived in the odium of having invented sodium. Limerick is a verse form composed of 5 or sometimes 4 lines rhyming A, of which the first and second and fifth are trimeter and the third and fourth are diameter. Here is, for instance, an example by Edward Lear. There was an old man of D, who was sadly annoyed by a flea, when he said within quote, I will scratch it, they gave him a hedge, which grieved that old man of the D, full stop. An amigram is anigra. Third, an epigram is a form of writing that makes a satiric or complimentary observation with wit, extreme condensation, and above all brevity. Here are 2 examples of epigrams written by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. What is an epigram? A dwarfish whole colon, its body brevity and wit its soul. Next stanza, Sir, I admit your general rule, that every poet is a fool, but you yourself may serve to show it that every fool is not a poet. Thank you.
Date, sometimes too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance, or nature's changing course untrimmed, but thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou possessed, nor shall death brag thou wondescent in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou grow sent, so long as men can breathe, or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. William Shakespeare. Villanelle. This is a poem in 6 stanzas, the first 5 of which are tercets and the final is a quatrain. The entire poem is constructed on 2 rhyme sounds and the stanzas are linked through repeat lines and the rhymes. The first line of the first stanza is repeated as the last line of the second and fourth stanzas, and the last line of the first stanza appears as the final line of the third and fifth stanzas, and both these lines, that is the first and last lines of the first stanza, form the concluding couplet of the sixth stanza. The form is used to express a variety of ideas and emotions from the most serious and philosophical to the most light-hearted. The challenge lies not only in the form but also in intensifying the expression with every repetition so that the form and substance complement each other and the poem moves forward not in fits and starts but with a renewed power and evocation. The final stanza should draw the reader into the poem to share the poet's concerns and feelings. Richo 1980, 10508. While the best known example of the villanelle is Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night by Dylan Thomas. Another well known practitioner of the form is Edwin Arlington Robinson, and here is his villanelle. The house on the hill. They are all gone away. The house is shut and still. There is nothing more to say. Through broken wall and grey the winds blow bleak and shrill. They are all gone away. Nor is there one today to speak them good or ill. There is nothing more to say. Why is it then we stray around the sunken sill? They are all gone away. Unit 3 Modes of Creative Writing 63. Unit 03. Creative Writing 728/20084441 p.m. page 63. Haiku. This Japanese form is a short, self-contained 17-syllable form that is composed of 3 lines with 5, 7 and 5 syllables respectively. The aim of the haiku is to express a delicate and nuanced insight through a concrete image. The poem evolves from a single image and the imagery is primarily drawn from nature with the time of the year, season, implied or stated. The last line of the haiku is vital since it is the insight line and reveals the intent or meaning of the whole poem. Ibid. 98. Now the swinging bridge is quietened with creepers like our tendrilled lives. Basho. 64. Creative writing. Activity 7. Retaining the two rhyme sounds, a and il. See if you can rewrite this villanelle in a different mood by changing the two refrain lines. Activity 8. Now it is your turn to write a haiku. Try these exercises first. A. Fill in the 7-syllable line between these two 5-syllable lines to complete this haiku. Green elms in the woods. Standing tall and proud. B. Now fill in the two 5-syllable lines above and below this 7-syllable line. The petals bend to the earth. Now write your own haiku. One of the things you could write about is your favorite sport. Decide for what purpose you are writing and what is the mood you want to convey. Think of all the images and descriptive words, as well as figurative language you could use to convey the sounds, sights, and smells. And our poor fancy play for them is wasted skill. There is nothing more to say. There is ruin and decay in the house on the hill, they are all gone away. There is nothing more to say. Unit 03. Creative Writing 728/2008 p.m. page 64. Light-hearted forms. Humor is also a vital ingredient of poetry, and clerehues, limericks and epigrams, have been written to great poetic impact. One a clerihue consists of two couplets of unequal length, often with complex and sometimes ridiculous rhymes, and presents a potted biography of a famous person or historical character. The humor consists in concentrating on the trivial, fantastic or ridiculous, and presenting it with great solemnity as if it were characteristic, significant or essential. Examples from the poems of Edmund Clerihew Bentley, who gave this form its name, are given below. The art of biography is different from geography. Geography is about maps, but biography is about chaps. Sir Humphrey Davy detested gravy. He lived in the odium of having invented sodium. 2. A limerick is a verse form composed of 5, or sometimes 4, lines rhyming upper, of which the first, second and fifth are trimeter and the third and fourth dimeter. Here is, for instance, an example by Edward Lear. There was an old man of D, who was sadly annoyed by a flea. When he said, "I will scratch it," they gave him a hatchet, which grieved that old man of the D. 3. An epigram is a form of writing that makes a satiric or complimentary observation with wit, extreme condensation, and above all, brevity. Here are two examples of epigrams written by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. What is an epigram? A dwarfish whole, its body brevity, and wit its soul. Sir, I admit your general rule, that every poet is a fool, but you yourself may serve to show it, that every fool is not a poet. Unit 3 Modes of Creative Writing 65. Activity 9. Find a clerihue, limerick and epigram, and bring them the class. Write a limerick starting with the line, "Today is Monday." Unit 03. Creative Writing 728/2008 p.m. page 65. Free verse. This is poetry whose verse is not based on the recurrence of stress accent in a regular, measurable pattern, but rather on the irregular rhythmic cadence of significant phrases, image patterns, and the like. It is the refusal of English to conform to standard prosody that has given rise to free verse, but that does not mean that this form does not have any limitations or guiding principles. The crux of the question here is measure. In free verse, the measure has been loosened to give more play to vocabulary and syntax, hence, to the mind in its excursions. The bracket of the customary foot has been expanded so that more syllables, words or phrases can be admitted into its confines. The new unit may be called the variable foot, a term and concept already accepted widely as a means of bringing the warring elements of freedom and discipline together. It rejects the standard of the conventionally fixed foot and suggests that measure varies with the idiom by which it is employed and the tonality of the individual poem. Thus, as in speech, the prosodic pattern is evaluated by criteria of effectiveness and expressiveness rather than mechanical syllable counts. Framing in 1974, 289. If free verse is about the right of English to dance to a different rhythm, the opening stanza of this poem by Kamala Das is a wonderful example of freedom in verse and life. D'Souza 1997, 1011. An introduction. I don't know politics, but I know the names of those in power, and can repeat them like days of the week, or names of months, beginning with Nehru. I am Indian, very brown, born in Malabar. I speak three languages, write in two, dream in one. Don't write in English, they said. English is not your mother tongue. Why not leave me alone? Critics, friends, visiting cousins, every one of you. Why not let me speak in any language I like? The language I speak becomes mine, its distortions, its queerness all mine, mine alone. It is half English, half Indian, funny perhaps, but it is honest, it is as human as I am human, don't you see? It voices my joys, my longings, my hopes, and it is useful to me as cawing is to crows or roaring to the lions. It is human speech, the speech of the mind that is here and not there, a mind that sees and hears and is aware. Not the deaf, blind speech of trees in storm or of monsoon clouds or of rain or the incoherent murmurings of the blazing funeral pyre. I was child, and later they told me I grew, for I became tall, my limbs swelled and one or two places sprouted hair. When I asked for love, not knowing what else to ask for, he drew a youth of 16 into the bedroom and closed the door. He did not beat me, but my sad woman body felt so beaten. 66 Creative Writing. Unit 03. Creative Writing 728/200841 p.m. page 66. Dominant modes of poetry, lyrical, narrative, and dramatic. Lyric. The lyrical mode refers to the nature of the language, tonality, mood and emotional expression in the poem. Lyric poetry is that which most prominently retains evidence of the origins of poetry in musical expression, singing, chanting and recitation to musical accompaniment. The musical element is, therefore, intrinsic to this mode of writing and becomes the focal point to the poet's expression. As Lascelles Abercrombie says, a poet does not compose in order to make of language delightful and exciting music. He composes a delightful and exciting music in language in order to make what he has to say peculiarly efficacious in our minds. Framing in 1974, 462. That a lyric is primarily a poem written to be sung, is something we still agree with as we refer to the words of a song as its lyrics. The forms and styles most often included in this category are songs, hymns and psalms, ballads, elegies, odes, sonnets, pastorals, idylls, epitaphs, reflections, and poems on the subjects of religion, love, friendship, nature, patriotism, war, childhood, and other preoccupations of our daily lives. The principal quality of lyrical poetry is its melodic tonality working in accord with its rhythms. Below is an example of a conventional love poem by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Sonnets from the Portuguese 43. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach, when feeling out of sight for the ends of being an ideal grace. I love thee to the level of every day's most quiet need, by sun and candlelight. I love thee freely, as men strive for right, I love thee purely, as they turn from praise. I love thee with the passion put to use in my old griefs, and with my childhood's faith. I love thee with a love I seemed to lose with my lost saints. I love thee with the breath, smiles, tears, of all my life. And, if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death. Unit 3 Modes of Creative Writing 67. Activity 10. Poetry abounds with examples of love lyrics. Read as many as you can and find one that really appeals to you. Then try and find out what is it that you found appealing, the way the poet dealt with the subject matter, the words as he used or something else, maybe the music of the words themselves. Now compare a traditional love lyric with a contemporary one and try and see what has changed the emotion, its expression, or both. Unit 03. Creative Writing 728/200841 p.m. page 67. The most melodious form of the lyric is songs that originate from the time when poetry was actually sung, and its inventory included songs of love, war, patriotism, and peace. In songs, both sacred and secular, language is used in its simplest manifestations with reliance placed on emotional content to enhance the richness of the words even further, and the object is to let the sounds pour forth directly and clearly. Poetry in English abounds with examples of lyrical songs that date back to the English Bible, King James Version, and come right up to contemporary times. One of the important forms of the lyric is the elegy, expressing themes of death, love, and war, and often having a didactic purpose, that is, an attempt to teach the reader a moral or social lesson. A stanza from Thomas Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard will give you an idea of the form and its primary tone. Full many a gem of purest ray serene the dark unfathomed caves of ocean bear, full many a flood is born to blush unseen, and waste its sweetness on the desert air. Odes. Ode comes from the Greek aidein, to sing or chant. It is the most formal, complex, and ceremonious of lyric forms. The ode is serious, elevated, and paced in a deliberate and ponderous manner. The form is mostly used to express the poet's deepest personal feelings concerning an event or a person. The form originated in the songs of the chorus in Greek drama and has a threefold division. The first stanza or section is the strophe, turn, the middle one the antistrophe, counterturn, and the final stanza or section, the epode, aftersong. The movement of the ode, like its stanza division, is also threefold and moves first in one direction, then in the opposite direction, and the final stanza is one of repose or standing still. Richo 1980-82. While this is the convention, many odes may not follow this scheme. Ode on Melancholy. No, no, go not to Leith, neither twist wolf's bane, tight-rooted, for its poisonous wine, nor suffer thy pale forehead to be kissed by nightshade, ruby grapes of Proserpine, make not your rosary of yew berries, nor let the beetle, nor the death moth be your mournful psyche, nor the downy owl a partner in your sorrow's mysteries, for shade to shade will come too drowsily, and drown the wakeful anguish of the soul. But when the melancholy fit shall fall sudden from heaven like a weeping cloud, that fosters the droop-headed flowers all, and hides the green hill in an April shroud, then glut thy sorrow on a morning rose, or on the rainbow of the salt sand wave, or on the wealth of globed peonies. 68 Creative Writing. Unit 03. Creative Writing 728/200841 p.m. page 68. Or if thy mistress some rich anger shows, imprison her soft hand, and let her rave, and feed deep, deep upon her peerless eyes. She dwells with beauty, beauty that must die, and joy, whose hand is ever at his lips bidding adieu, and aching pleasure nigh, turning to poison while the bee-mouth sips, in the very temple of delight Veiled melancholy has her sovereign shrine, though seen of none save him whose strenuous tongue can burst joy's grape against his palate fine, his soul shall taste the sadness of her might, and be among her cloudy trophies hung. John Keats. Narrative poetry. Narrative poetry is concerned primarily with telling a story in verse form, and its two basic types are the ballad and the epic. Ballads. An important form of the narrative is the ballad, which, although it combines the lyrical, dramatic, and narrative, also has a clearly defined pattern in which stanzas and lines are arranged in a regular, repetitive rhythm and the lines have a resounding interplay of rhyme. Ballads are normally set to music and can therefore be defined as a narrative poem that is lyrical in tonality, includes dramatic elements, character and dialogue, and reveals a situation already existing and follows it to its conclusion. Richo 1980, 79. Ballads focus on a single crucial episode or situation. The ballad usually begins at a point where the action is moving decisively towards its catastrophe and the focus is on the emotional impact of the climax. Folk ballads were originally passed on orally and developed into storytelling devices to describe events of general interest. You probably remember reading the much anthologized Lochinvar. Read it again and see how the rhythm and the story move together. Epics. Epics are long narratives, which deal with events that have importance in the life of an individual, community, or a nation. You are familiar with the Indian epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and of course the famous Greek epics Iliad and Odyssey. Some of the defining criteria of epics are their seriousness of tone and excellence of expression, scope and inclusiveness, coherence of structure, and a contemporary relevance combined with a universal appeal. That is, the poet speaks of a particular time and place, but the ideas and emotions are for all time. Here are the opening lines from John Milton's Paradise Lost, a classic epic, followed by the opening canto, the equivalent of a stanza in a poem or a chapter in a novel, of Vikram Seth's The Golden Gate, an epic of today, from Panikkar 2004, 167. Unit 3 Modes of Creative Writing 69. Unit 03. Creative Writing 728/2008 p.m. page 69. Book I. Of man's first disobedience, and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world, and all our woe, with loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us, and regain the blissful seat, sing heavenly muse, John Milton. I.1. To make a start more swift than weighty, hail muse. Dear reader, once upon a time, say, circa 1980, there lived a man. His name was John. Successful in his field though only 26, respected, lonely, one evening as he walked across Golden Gate Park, the ill-judged toss of a red frisbee almost brained him. He thought, if I died, who would be sad? Who would weep? Who would gloat? Who would be glad? Would anybody? As it pained him, he turned from his dispiriting theme to ruminations less extreme. Vikram Seth. Narrative poetry continues to be a popular form as it evocatively expresses contemporary concerns, as in this poem written by Wilfred Owen that expresses the horrors of war more vividly than newspaper reports or articles ever can. Dulce et decorum est. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of tired, outstripped 5 nines that dropped behind. Gas, gas, quick, was, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim, through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. 70 Creative Writing. Unit 03. Creative Writing 728/2008 p.m. page 70. If in some smothering dreams you too could piss behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil's sick of sin, if you could hear, at every jolt, the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cut of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. Wilfred Owen. Indian English poetry has abundant examples of narrative poetry that talks about the horrors and pathos of contemporary life. Whether it is Jayanta Mahapatra who talks in her trending verse about the poverty of Orissa or Keki in Daruvala who makes us feel for the suffering of the poor peasants of Uttar Pradesh who depend on the rain to survive. Most contemporary poets seem to feel that the best use to which the vehicle of poetry can be put is to carry a message to readers about what the world outside is like. So poetry is not just about pretty images and broken hearts but is a powerful means of reflecting the reality of contemporary society. Read this poem and see what a skilled poet like Jayanta Mahapatra can do with a newspaper headline. Victim number 569, Leela, aged 5, daughter of Dayaram of Chola Kenchi, Bhopal. Died of gas poisoning on 3rd December 1984. India Today cover photograph, 31st December 1984. Victim number 569. I. The eyes are deep and hard in Leela's sockets. And the face looks peaceful in death. That's what they say, the onlookers. What would Leela have said had she grown up to her father's age? But her face, it seems to grow best in death. Her father Dayaram of Chola Kenchi would never believe me, his half-waking mind trying fruitlessly to drain the sea of his reality. Soon he will burn Leela out of himself. Soon her eyes will soften, turn glutinous and fume. Perhaps something crueler will happen even here along with the fish rising gracefully from the river in wispy nets. Poem number 24 Dispossessed Nests, 41. Unit 3 Modes of Creative Writing 71. Both Owen and Mahapatra use the narrative mode to talk about the death of innocence. Compare the two poems and see what the poet has done to evoke your response without making the poem too emotional or pathetic. Now choose a headline from the newspaper and write a stanza either describing the event or your reaction to it. Unit 03, Creative Writing 728/2008 p.m. page 71. Dramatic Poetry. Dramatic poetry emphasizes the showing, rather than the telling, of experiences and presents its story in a dramatic form through dialogues, monologues, etc. The elements of time, place, and the events described are made known by the poem itself. In the narrative poem, like the ones above, the poet speaks in his own person while setting the scene or explaining the event. In the dramatic, the group of characters created by the poet, including the persona in the poem, remains center stage and the poet's intention is description without explicit judgment, that you as the reader need to work out for yourself. Rukmini Bhai Nair puts the dramatic form to very good use in this poem to talk about the problem of identity. Yesterday I stood on tiptoe like a goat in search of high, tenderest. to the world, and all our woe, with loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us, and regain the blissful seat, sing heavenly muse, John Milton. I.1. To make a start more swift than weighty, hail muse. Dear reader, once upon a time, say, circa 1980, there lived a man. His name was John. Successful in his field though only 26, respected, lonely, one evening as he walked across Golden Gate Park, the ill-judged toss of a red frisbee almost brained him. He thought, if I died, who would be sad? Who would weep? Who would gloat? Who would be glad? Would anybody? As it pained him, he turned from his dispiriting theme to ruminations less extreme. Vikram Seth. Narrative poetry continues to be a popular form as it evocatively expresses contemporary concerns, as in this poem written by Wilfred Owen that expresses the horrors of war more vividly than newspaper reports or articles ever can. Dulce et decorum est. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of tired, outstripped 5 9s that dropped behind. Gas, gas, quick, was, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim, through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. 70 Creative Writing. Unit 03. Creative Writing 728/2008 p.m. page 70. If in some smothering dreams you too could piss behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his hanging face, like a devil's sick of sin, if you could hear, at every jolt, the blood come gurgling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cut of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro. Patria mori. Wilfred Owen. Indian English poetry has abundant examples of narrative poetry that talks about the horrors and pathos of contemporary life. Whether it is Jayanta Mahapatra who talks in her trending verse about the poverty of Orissa or Keki in Daruvala who makes us feel for the suffering of the poor peasants of Uttar Pradesh who depend on the rain to survive. Most contemporary poets seem to feel that the best use to which the vehicle of poetry can be put is to carry a message to readers about what the world outside is like. So poetry is not just about pretty images and broken hearts but is a powerful means of reflecting the reality of contemporary society. Read this poem and see what a skilled poet like Jayanta Mahapatra can do with a newspaper headline. Victim number 569, Leela, aged 5, daughter of Dayaram of Chola Kenchi, Bhopal. Died of gas poisoning on 3rd December 1984. India Today cover photograph, 31st December 1984. Victim number 569. I. The eyes are deep and hard in Leela's sockets. And the face looks peaceful in death. That's what they say, the onlookers. What would Leela have said had she grown up to her father's age? But her face, it seems to grow best in death. Her father Dayaram of Chola Kenchi would never believe me, his half-waking mind trying fruitlessly to drain the sea of his reality. Soon he will burn Leela out of himself. Soon her eyes will soften, turn glutinous and fume. Perhaps something crueler will happen even here along with the fish rising gracefully from the river in wispy nets. Poem number 24 Dispossessed Nests, 41. Unit 3 Modes of Creative Writing 71. Both Owen and Mahapatra use the narrative mode to talk about the death of innocence. Compare the two poems and see what the poet has done to evoke your response without making the poem too emotional or pathetic. Now choose a headline from the newspaper and write a stanza either describing the event or your reaction to it. Unit 03, Creative Writing 728/2008 p.m. page 71. Dramatic Poetry. Dramatic poetry emphasizes the showing, rather than the telling, of experiences and presents its story in a dramatic form through dialogues, monologues, etc. The elements of time, place, and the events described are made known by the poem itself. In the narrative poem, like the ones above, the poet speaks in his own person while setting the scene or explaining the event. In the dramatic, the group of characters created by the poet, including the persona in the poem, remains center stage, and the poet's intention is description without explicit judgment, that you as the reader need to work out for yourself. Rukmini Bhai Nair puts the dramatic form to very good use in this poem to talk about the problem of identity. Ordinary things. Yesterday I stood on tiptoe like a goat in search of high, tenderest leaves. The washing flapped in my face, a wind-blown tree in some strip of earth, somewhere. I turned to the sea, it lay at my feet, the Bay of Bengal, in a bucket, heaving. Now I had something rare, a catch my clothesline stretched across the sky. 6 pigs dangled, colored, tints and spare out of reach, they would not let me hang. My new sea treasures by their branches, their scrubby protuberances meant for such. What goats do in such a happenstance, feeding, frustrated, on a high promontory of a coastal strip, I do not know, perhaps they turn their hairy butts and walk away, but instead, I lifted my unwary face, lashless, to the salty air. It was the sun that lay in wait, rushed at me, a wild and hungry beast. Afterwards, I could not see, my eyes dripped, and the color of my washing was neither white nor wholly soiled, crushed bones or clothes. I did not care. The taste of fear remained with me. Goat stalked and caught defenselessly. Hired bone, 1516. 72 Creative Writing. The dramatic monologue is a poem consisting of the words of a single speaker who reveals the dramatic situation and his or her own character. Robert Browning is one of the finest original practitioners of this form, and you should read some of his poems for models of dramatic poetry. Unit 03, Creative Writing 728/2008 p.m. page 72. Unit 3, Modes of Creative Writing 73. Another useful distinction that is made in poetry is that between classical and romantic. Classical poetry is that which displays balance and restraint, unity, proportion and purity of form, while romantic poetry relies for its effect on the subjective and personal expression of ideas. The latter kind of poetry is written when the poet sees her himself at the center of a personal conflict or struggle and suffers because of an impersonal world. The poet who adopts the classical stance assumes a distance from his subject matter and attempts an objectivity and universality of expression. Romantic poetry exhibits lushness in contrast to the spare beauty of the classical. Some of the finest and most evocative Indian English poetry is written in the classical style insofar as is very controlled in its expression and yet talks about thoughts and experiences that have made an impact on the mind and heart of the poet. Indian poetry in English is also classical in another sense. In its form and ideas, it uses the traditions of the poet's mother tongue in a unique manner, and the result is poetry that is individualistic and yet involves the reader in its universal concerns. Here is a poem by R. Parthasarathi, whose theme is metapoetic, that is about the writing of poetry itself. In a country where writers who chose English as their medium of creative expression have had to fight a long battle to be accepted, Parthasarathis concerns are of great interest to us. Please notice how he uses a series of tercets to create a poem about writing poetry in English, not by being derivative but using the rich reservoir of native traditions. Homecoming. To live in Tamil Nadu is to be conscious every day of importance. There is the language, for instance. The bull that Nammalwa one took by the horns is today an unrecognizable carcass, quick with the fleece of Kudambakam. 2. There is little you can do about it except to throw up your hands. How long can foreign poets provide the staple of your lines? Turn inward. Scrape the bottom of your past. Ransack the cupboard. For skeletons of your Brahman childhood, the nights with father droning the 4003 as sleep pinched your thighs blue. You may then perhaps strike out a line for yourself from the iron of life's ordinariness. R. Parthasarthi, Rough Passage, 48. 1 Nammalwar, ca. 889-30, was a Tamil saint poet. 2 Kudambakam, a suburb of Chennai, is the center of the Tamil film industry. 3 The 4000 is a collection of hymns, including 1102 hymns by Nammalwar, composed between the 6th and 9th centuries. Unit 03, Creative Writing 728/200841 p.m. page 73. Ghazals in English are another example of the use of a classical form in a contemporary context. This poetic form has its origins in Persian, Arabic and Urdu and is made up of a series of couplets, each emotionally and thematically complete in itself. One couplet may be comic, another tragic, another romantic, another religious, and another political. The poem should have no enjambments between couplets, and the ghazal as a whole has a complex unity built on association, memory, and expectation. The opening couplet called the matla sets up the scheme of rhyme, kefia, and refrain, redif, by having it occur in both lines, the rhyme immediately preceding the refrain, and then this scheme is repeated in the second line of each couplet. The themes are normally melancholic, amorous, and philosophical. Another characteristic of the ghazal is the inclusion of the poet's name in the penultimate or last couplet, Ali, 2-4. Here is a ghazal by another Indian English poet K.K. M. Daruwalla. Partition Ghazal. This may pass muster and yet may not pass. This past we are talking about is not the past. This may pass muster and yet may not pass. The past is heavy on our shoulders. Good, it is the past. Tenses curve and coil through the murk of time. The past erupts except that it is not the past. Beyond the linear and hence beyond the line, the magic lantern images of memory flash past. Gandhi's eggshell head, round as a shrunken sun, has it set forever into a black hole past. Not that Gandhi looked the only anchorite. Jinnah looked ascetic too. How the years passed. This should pass muster and yet may not pass. All tenses are tricky, especially the past. The lesson for you, wine bibbling Kelusru, the past you talk of may not have been the past. Keki N. Daruwala, Ali 2000, 48. Voices in the poem. Every poem speaks through a voice or voices that the poet uses to communicate with the reader. Behind the voice is the persona created by the poet, and this could be the poet her himself or a historical fictional character created by the poet. The persona could also be symbolic, representative of a thought, idea, or experience, represented through language and rhythm. The use of the persona helps the poet to depersonalize experience and make it universal so that readers across time and space can participate in the poem. 74 Creative Writing. Notice how both the villanelle and the ghazal use the refrain, not only for emphasis, since the line that is echoed in the refrain is the central image theme of the poem, but also to give the poem a rhythm that is song-like in its harmony. Think of your favorite songs and see how many of them use a refrain to give the composition circularity, a repetitive recurrence, and rhythm. Unit 03, Creative Writing 728/200841 p.m. page 74. Here is the poem A Morning Walk by Nissim Ezekiel that brings together a lot of what we have been talking about. See how the effect of rhythm is achieved and the central image of the city around which all the minutiae of everyday existence become symbolic of the personal history of the poet, and this in turn becomes a synecdoche for the history of the whole subcontinent. The tone combines irony and nostalgia.
The knife was poised, the arm was strong. She cried again, I have done no wrong. The huntsman's heart began to flutter, it melted like a pound of butter. He murmured, okay, beat it, kid, and you can bet your life she did. Later, the huntsman made a stop within the local butcher's shop, and there he bought for safety's sake a bullock's heart and one night steak. "O Majesty, O Queen," he cried, "that rotten girl has just died, and just to prove I didn't cheer, I have brought along these bits of meat." The Queen cried out, "Bravissimo, I trust you killed her nice and slow." Then, within the bracket, this is the disgusting part, bracket close, the Queen sat down and ate the heart within bracket. I only hope she cooled it well. Boiled heart can be as tough as hell. Bracket close. While all of this was wrong on, oh where had Snow White gone? She had found it easy, being pretty, to hitch a ride into the city, and there she had got a job unpaid as general cook and parlour maid, with 7 funny little men, each one not more than 3 foot 10. Ex-horse race jockeys, all of them, these 7 dwarfs, though awfully nice, were guilty of one shocking vice. They squandered all of their resources at the racetrack backing horses. Within bracket, when they hadn't bagged a winner, none of them got any dinner. Bracket close. One evening Snow White said, "Look here, I think I have got a great idea. Just leave it all to me, okay? Question mark. And no more gambling till I see." That very night, at eventide, young Snow White hitched another ride, and then, when it was very late, she slipped in through the palace gate. The king was in his counting house, counting out his money. The queen was in the parlour, eating bread and honey. The footmen and the servants slept, so no one saw her as she crept on tiptoe through the mighty hall and grabbed the mirror off the wall. As soon as she had got it home, she told the senior dwarf or genome to ask it when he wished to know. "Go on," she shouted, "have a go." He said, "Oh mirror, please don't joke. Which horse will win tomorrow's race?" The Ascot Gold Cup steeplechase, the mirror whispered, sweet and low. "The horse's name is Mistletoe." The dwarf went absolutely daft. They kissed young Snow White fore and aft. They rushed away the race, some dough with which to bag old Mistletoe. They pawned their watches, sold the car, they borrowed money near and far. Within brackets, for much of it they had to thank the manager of Barclays Bank, bracket close. They went to escort, and of course, for once they backed the winning horse. Thereafter, every single day, the mirror made the bookies pay. Each dwarf and Snow White got a share, and each was soon a millionaire. Which shows the gambling's not a sin, provided that you always win. uh, Activity 13, which is your favorite children's story. See if you can rewrite it as a poem using any of the form you have learned about. The 10 commandments of crafting verse for young readers. While it is interesting to know how and where children's verse started and the kinds of themes that have been popular, we are concerned here with the crafting of verse for children and will begin by looking at some do's and don'ts. Never preach to your reader. The first rule then is work with the theme and not the moral. Second point, always write for yourself as well as your young reader. Good children's verse appeal to all age group. Point 3, don't be obsessed about vocabulary levels. Children will read what interests and delight them. If they don't understand a word or two, so what? Point 3, remember a poem is a word puzzle. If you did not have fun putting it together, your readers wouldn't enjoy solving it either. Point 3, think of your audience. What stage of development are they at? Question mark. What are their concerns? Question mark. What kind of peer and parental slash family pressure do they face? Question mark. Point 3, think of the verse as a soundtrack. Use lots of alliteration, assonance, onomatopoeia, sibilance, consonants, delightful sound clusters, and tongue twisting syllables. Your readers should be able to taste the word on their tongues and delight in their noise of the words. Make sure you suit your rhythm and melody to the sense. Alliteration speeds up the rhythm and makes the poem dance with joy. Assonance slow down the rhythm and is better used for a more serious subject. Point 3, try a few traditional verse forms and see what you can do with them. While in adult verse, we look for surprises, places where the meter breaks down. The pleasure of nursery rhymes and nonsense verse derives from its predictability. We may not know what the word means, but can guess which sound will follow. Think of the verse as an image track. Avoid abstract language and form your surrounding. Use as many concrete images as you can. Pay attention to the point of view and the eye of the camera and focus on what you can see with your naked eye and poet's vision. Try lexical ambiguity and oxymorons. Think of rhythm as pulling the reader across the page. Don't write long, droning lines useless. You are writing a lullaby. Let us now look at what Sampurna Chatterjee, a Bombay-based poet, short fiction writer and translator, has to say. The problem with writing poetry. In January this year, I attended a seminar on poetry for young audiences organized by the Sahitya Academy in association with the Max Muller Bhavan and Locations, a Bombay-based reading circle. As the discussion began on the participants' personal experience of writing, reading, or teaching poetry, a number of concerns gradually became apparent. One, where was the poetry being written specifically for young people in English? Question mark. As the students lamented, the poems being taught in the English class, be it at school or junior college level, ran the risk of seeming fossilized. The lack of context and the inability to relate to the poem in the syllabus seemed to be a common problem. 2. How was poetry being taught? To understand a poem seemed to mean being able to paraphrase it. Where was the joy in the language, the pleasure of hearing poetry spoken out loud, and the resonance of communication? Question mark. 3. Who was publishing new poetry written specifically for young audiences? Question mark. Clearly, these and other vexing questions were a terrain fraught with pitfalls, some of which made me think of my own interactions with young people over poetry. In July 2005, I was invited to conduct a session on images in poetry for a group of college students who were doing a film workshop and being taught the basics of editing and would make their own film using archival material on Mumbai city. I had been asked to help them see that images are not the currency of the audio-visual medium alone. That poets use images in different complex ways: use, seek, assimilate, construct, preserve, focus, frame. I decided to choose my words from a vocabulary that they might understand. We talked about images, silences, and pauses. We talked of things difficult to capture through image as word, loss, transience, and exile. Poetry as tactile, breathing reality, tangential, symbolic, specific. And when I asked them why they thought no one read poetry, they said because it requires you to think. It takes time to understand. It's not easy. People are afraid. At the same time, we also talked about how infectious the joy of good poetry is. At a workshop this May at the Prithvi, which I call a poem in 5 acts, for 13 to 16-year-olds, I set out to make a poetry a bit of all then it didn't seem to be real, accessible, enjoyable, and doable. Realizing also that the young poet is burdened with received notions of what poetry should be, my attempt was to make them arrive at other kinds of conclusion about the writing of poetry. The notion, for example, the poetry should be inspiring or deep or full of words like magnificent, extravagant, doomed, and divine. Through a series of exercise and poems, I could see them relishing and realizing the fact that poem can be conversational, inhabit different personas, and speak in different registers. Or the notion that poetry had to be written in neat little stanzas, and had to be a specific length. With all of these notions being challenged through the poems that we read, I could see it taking hold, the excitement of having the freedom to write a poem in one's own voice, but not all at once. Very often I could see at the writing stage how the tussle between sounding like a poet and me aged 20 muddied the clear and luminous line with clinch and borrow phrases and images. Here was the age-old tussle between poetry as something abstract and out of reach versus poetry as something direct, approachable, and rooted. Getting down to writing poetry. No one can actually teach you to write poetry. You will learn best by reading and writing poems. But you have been introduced to techniques and types and also seen how carefully your crafting has to be achieve authenticity of expressions. Some themes. Nature is a favorite theme with poets since it offers an abundant resource of ideas and images. If you are planning to write a nature's poem, begin by going out and exploring it in its abundant variety. Some of the things that nature offers to us are: it stimulates our sensory perceptions and symbolizes permanence and tranquility. Your poem, with nature as its setting and theme, should relate to human emotions, be expressed in simple language, and have images that are taken from the world of nature. Since practically the beginning of literary criticism, nature has been seen as central to the art and craft of poetry. Since poetry is, in the words of Dryden, the image of nature, in this context, nature includes rocks, streams, and hills that men can admire, live among and fancifully rearrange, but also human nature that is universal in certain fundamental ways. Social issues are also the subject matter of many poems whose interest is with the society and milieu in which they are located and from where they emanate. These poems normally adopt one of two stances. Firstly, the universalizing of a topic occurrence. Secondly, the particularizing of a universal phenomena, the subject matter of these poems in the environment we live in, social, political, economic, religious, etc. Romantic themes abound in poetry, and such poems are characterized by a sense of wonder, mystery, subjectivity, emotional involvement, infinity, and freedom. Romantic poems normally talk about nature, love, memories of the past, etc. A poetic description of this kind of poetry can be found in this section of T.S. Eliot's Preludes. I am moved by fancies that are curled around these images and cling to the notion of some infinitely gentle, infinitely suffering things. A language is a system of verbal signs by means of which humans can communicate with one another. One of its outstanding features is that these signs have content, refers to the world of experience, and stand for things. Ordinarily, this is the feature of greatest use, and everyday language functions in the main as a way of transaction to pass something on from one person to the next. Its content is what matters. We must now think of language in poetry as having somehow escaped the servitude under which language toils in everyday life. It is as though language had long nourished an ambition to be itself the subject of the transaction rather than the means, as though somehow this were the goal which the inherent logic of its nature made desirable despite rather than the means, as though somehow the goal which the inherent logic of nature made desirable, despite the fact that by far the greatest portion of language, however is measured, continues without any appearance of strain to function referentially as indicated above. Poetry is language that asserts itself. Poetry is refractory, opaque, durable. Using materials from the verbal traffic of everyday life, poetry manages to secure for them exemption from the common fate of language. It is not even defeated by our lack of complete understanding. It prevents this easy transaction of perpetually withholding some indefinable remainder of its meaning, forcing us to come back to the language again and again. Having placed ourselves within the charmed circle, we can share in the feelings of achievement even though we are in some sense a victim. For language is a human achievement and poetry is language triumphant. Within brackets, Wheeler, 30 से 31, bracket close. Uh, Our proposal is that you don't worry too much about correct and wrong definition or methods, but give yourself plenty of opportunities to discover for yourself what kind of poem you like and what you don't, and also take time to work out why. We also think you need to begin with models to work from and say what you want to say in whatever form you choose. Bierne, within brackets Bierne 2002 colon 108 bracket close. Let's write a poem. Step 1. Start with an idea, an object, an experience, a person, a memory, a phrase, an image, or even a word. What sort of poem will it be? Question mark. Long or short? Question mark. Lyric, narrative, or dramatic? Question mark. Sonnet, haiku, syllabic? Question mark. An experimental gamble? Question mark. Who are your readers? Question mark. Sometimes the of answer to these and other initial questions will not be visible at the beginning. You will find yourself working with and on the material before recognizing what shape the poem is going to take. Keep yourself open intellectually and emotionally. Step 2. Get your raw materials into some kind of temporary organization so that you can grapple with it. You have responded to the initial impulse prompted by what seeded the poem in you. Now you have to struggle to achieve a rough shape and sketchy sequence, even if these change completely later. Step 3. Write down your tentative lines and find words to express what you want to say and decide how you want to say it. How would you like to open? Directly, by indicating clearly what is to follow, obliquely, so that the reader is shocked or surprised later, dramatically, so that attention is drawn to your poem right at the outset, with an image that can be expanded or changed later, or casually or conversationally, so that you have the freedom to move in whatever direction the poem takes you. What kind of lines will you write in? Long or short or a combination of both? Question mark. How will you develop your theme? Through metaphors and other figures of speech, through language, or in some other way? How will your poem end? Question mark. Step 4. Read the poem to yourself. Does it have substance? Question mark. Does it have a shape that looks authentic enough? Question mark. Is there some kind of unity? Question mark. Does it make sense? Question mark. Does it seem to move logically to its ending? Question mark. You now have a full-fledged first draft. Step 5. Revise by yourself and discuss the poem in your group and then revise again. Keep doing this till it sounds right. Remember, a poem is many things at the same time: an expression of emotion, a felt experience, a performance, and a created illusion. How can these ineffable things be communicated? Question mark. Feeling by itself does not make a poem. A poem cannot be written without it, of course, but depth of emotion alone does not make a poem. Neither do craft and skills. You have already come equipped with feeling and sensitivity,